There's a difference between a man who knows his worth and a man who lets others decide it for him. The day I caught my wife cheating, I chose to remind them all exactly who I was. My name is Warren Rollins. I'm 58 years old, built like a man who spent a lifetime working with his hands, and I run Rollins Leatherworks, a shop that's been in my family for 3 generations. My old man taught me the craft, same way his father taught him: tanner's hands, steady grip, respect for the tools. I've been shaping leather since I was 12, cutting, stitching, making something real, something that lasts. I don't say much unless it needs saying, and when I do, people listen. That's the way it's always been. My wife, Tessa, is 19 years younger than me. A polished woman, always put together. Blonde, sharp dresser, walks like she's got somewhere important to be even when she doesn't. When we met, she liked that I was solid, that I didn't waver. Said she felt safe with me. But safe isn't exciting, and after 15 years of marriage, she started looking for something else. I noticed the changes in small ways at first. She used to check in when she worked late, just a quick call, a text, nothing special, but consistent. Then one day, she stopped. I'd ask, and she'd say something about a project, a deadline, a meeting that ran long. I knew better than to press. A man who pushes too hard makes himself look weak. So I waited, watched, and let the pieces come to me. The first real crack showed when my buddy Mick let something slip. Mick runs the wood shop next to mine, a retired Marine who never lost that sharp way of looking at people. He doesn't talk just to hear himself speak, which is why I paid attention when he walked into my shop one morning, shook off the cold, and said, "Ran into a buddy of mine last night. Said he saw Tessa at the Magnolia Grill." She wasn't alone. I didn't react. Just kept burnishing the leather in my hands, slow and steady. "That's so." Said she was with some suit. Slick-looking guy. Lawyer type. I kept my focus on my work, but I could feel something settle in my gut. Magnolia Grill wasn't the kind of place you went for a casual business meeting. Not at 9 on a Friday night. Mick leaned on the counter, waiting. "Thanks for letting me know," I said finally. "That's it. For now." I spent the next few weeks gathering the proof I needed. A man shouldn't act without knowing exactly what he's dealing with. I checked her receipts, her credit card statements. She'd always handled the finances, said it was easier that way. Now I saw why. Charges at high-end bars, boutique hotels. I scrolled through her calendar, found the gaps, the times she said she was in meetings but had no record of where or with whom. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Confrontation gives people a chance to lie, to spin, to make excuses. No, I wanted something solid, something undeniable. So I asked Mick for a favor. A week later, he handed me a folder with a few crisp photographs inside. Tessa, sitting at a corner booth in a dimly lit restaurant, her hand resting on the wrist of a man in a tailored suit. Vince Reynolds. High-powered divorce attorney. The kind of guy who smelled like expensive cologne and bad intentions. I looked at the pictures, then closed the folder. Mick watched me, waiting for some kind of explosion. I just set the folder aside and reached for my coffee. "You good?" he asked. "I'm fine." "Damn, Warren. Most men be throwing punches or breaking something right about now." I took a slow sip of coffee, let the warmth settle. Most men don't think things through. Mick shook his head, but he knew better than to push. "So what's the plan?" I smiled, but there wasn't any humor in it. "I'm gonna let her bury herself. Then I'll make sure she stays buried." The thing about betrayal is, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every late night, every polite but distant smile, every absent touch. I saw it all now for what it was. A woman looking for an exit but too cowardly to open the door herself. I wasn't about to make it easy for her. I didn't change a damn thing. That was the first step. A man who overplays his hand loses before the game even starts. I kept my routine the same, woke up at 5, brewed my coffee, headed to the shop. Kissed Tessa on the cheek when I left, just like I always had. If she felt any guilt, she didn't show it. Or maybe she thought I was too blind to notice. The only difference was that now I had a plan. Tessa had been careful, but not careful enough. People get sloppy when they think they're getting away with something. I watched her, not in an obvious way, just enough to confirm what I already knew. She took more time getting ready in the mornings, checking herself in the mirror like she wasn't just dressing for the office. Her phone, which used to sit on the kitchen counter without a second thought, was now always face down, locked tight. I made sure she saw me doing exactly what I'd always done. Working late at the shop, grabbing a beer with Mick, running the business that kept a roof over our heads. I gave her no reason to suspect I knew. And in the meantime, I gathered every piece of leverage I could. The bank statements told a story. So did her messages, once I figured out how to get into her email. Tessa wasn't just playing around. She was planning. I found exchanges between her and Vince, subtle at first, then more direct. Discussions about finances, about assets, about me. That was when I knew this wasn't just a mistake. It was a calculation. One night, I came home earlier than usual. Tessa was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She didn't hear me coming right away, so I watched her for a second. She stood there, staring at the dark liquid in her glass, lost in thought. When she turned and saw me, she smiled, but it was automatic. The kind of smile people use when they're on autopilot. "Didn't hear you come in," she said. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." I walked over to the fridge, grabbed a beer, twisted the cap off. "How was your day?" She took a sip of wine before answering. "Busy. We're working on a big proposal for a client. Lot of moving parts." She always had an answer. Always had an explanation. That was the thing about Tessa, she was practical to a fault. She didn't lie for the thrill of it. She did it because it made sense. I leaned against the counter, watching her. "You seeing anyone from work these days?" Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, just for a second. "What do you mean?" "Just wondering if you've been out with anyone. Dinners, meetings, that kind of thing." She set her glass down carefully. "Why are you asking?" I shrugged. "No reason. Just figured if you were, you'd tell me." A hesitation. Then she smiled again, looser this time, like she convinced herself she was imagining the edge in my voice. "Nothing worth mentioning." I nodded, took a sip of my beer, and let the conversation die right there. No accusations. No fights. Just a quiet reminder that I was paying attention. That was all I needed. The seed was planted. Let her wonder. The next day, I took the folder Mick had given me, along with a few more pieces of evidence I'd gathered, and drove downtown to meet with my lawyer, Liz Nolan. Liz had been handling divorce cases for 30 years, and she had the kind of presence that made people sit up straight when she walked into a room. No nonsense, no wasted words. She glanced over the photos, then the statements I'd printed. "Clean," she said, flipping through them. "Hard to argue with evidence like this. You looking for a quick exit or something more permanent?" "Permanent," I said. "And I want it done right." She nodded. "She doesn't know you know?" "Not yet." "Good. That gives us the upper hand. You're the primary earner." "Yeah." "Then we make sure she gets as little as possible." I sat back, watching her work. Liz had the kind of efficiency I respected. No emotion, no unnecessary discussion. Just the facts, the process, the strategy. She looked up at me. "You want the house?" "No." I shook my head. "I want her to watch me walk away from it and land on my feet." That made her smile, just a little. "I can work with that." I left her office knowing exactly how this was going to play out. Tessa thought she had control, that she was the one making decisions. She had no idea that I'd already set the wheels in motion. That night, I sat in my workshop long after closing, running a strip of leather through my hands, feeling the texture, the strength of it. Some materials get weaker over time. Others just get tougher. Mick walked in, nodding toward the whiskey bottle on the workbench. "You drinking alone, or you pouring?" I grabbed another glass, poured him a finger. He took it, leaned against the counter. "So?" he asked. I took a sip, let the burn settle. "It's handled." He grunted. "Damn, Warren. You scare me sometimes." I looked at him and gave a slow smile. "Good." Tessa started noticing the shift before she could put a name to it. A woman like her, sharp and calculating, could pick up on changes in the air. She just didn't know what she was sensing. At first, she thought I was just distracted, caught up in work. She made a few half-hearted attempts at small talk over dinner, asked if I was feeling okay. I'd nod, chew my food, give her nothing. I still kissed her on the cheek when I left in the mornings, still asked about her day when I got home. But the warmth was gone. Not in a dramatic way, no cold stares, no slammed doors, just an absence. Like a fire that had gone out, leaving only a bit of smoke curling in the air. She tried to ignore it, but I could see her growing restless. One evening, she lingered in the doorway of my workshop, watching as I worked a fresh hide, stretching it across the workbench. I didn't acknowledge her right away, just kept my hands moving, letting the smell of treated leather and beeswax fill the room. "You've been quiet lately," she said, voice careful. I took my time setting the mallet down. "Have I?" She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Something on your mind?" I wiped my hands on a rag, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Nothing worth mentioning." She studied me, waiting for more. I didn't give it to her. A month ago, she might have pressed. Might have sweetened her voice, reached out to touch my arm, made an effort. Now, she just nodded, like she'd filed it away under things to worry about later. Later would come sooner than she thought. The next morning, she left earlier than usual, claiming she had meetings downtown. I let her go without a word, then made a call to Liz. She's getting ready to make a move, I told her. Liz hummed on the other end, tapping something against her desk. Good. That means she'll be sloppy. I had no doubt. Tessa was smart, but she was also impatient. She wanted an out, but she wanted it clean, easy, on her terms. What she didn't know was that I was already holding the pen. A few days later, I came home to find her at the kitchen table, laptop open, a stack of papers in front of her. She closed the screen when she heard me come in, too fast to be casual. I didn't acknowledge it. Just went to the fridge, grabbed a beer, twisted off the cap. She cleared her throat. I was thinking maybe we should talk. I took a sip, leaned against the counter. About what? She hesitated, then exhaled. Us. I nodded, like I was considering it. What about us? She glanced toward her laptop, her fingers twitching like she wanted to open it again. We've been growing apart. I let out a low chuckle, taking another sip. That right? Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She wasn't used to me being unreadable. It unsettled her. I think we need to be honest with each other, she said, sitting up straighter. I set my beer down, met her gaze. By all means. Be honest. That was when she faltered. For a second, I thought she might actually confess, might spill the whole damn thing in some sad attempt at damage control. But no, that wasn't Tessa's style. She dealt in half-truths, in controlled narratives. I feel like we've been living separate lives, she said instead. I don't want to hurt you, Warren, but hey. I held up a hand. Stop. She blinked. What? I picked up my beer again, taking my time with the next sip. You don't get to play the I don't want to hurt you card. You're smarter than that, Tessa. And so am I. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. She swallowed, hands gripping the edge of the table. What do you want? She asked finally, voice quieter. I smiled, slow and easy. To watch you lose. Her breath caught, just for a second. Warren. You had your fun, I said, pushing off the counter. Thought you were playing the long game. Thought you were planning your way out. What you didn't realize is, I was already ahead of you. Her face paled, lips parting like she wanted to deny it. I could see the gears turning, searching for an escape route, a way to regain control. But there wasn't one. I reached into my back pocket, pulled out an envelope, and set it on the table. Her name, written in Liz's clean, professional script. What is this? She asked, hesitant. Divorce papers. I tipped my beer toward her in a mock toast. You're welcome. She didn't move, didn't reach for the envelope. Just sat there, staring at it, like it might bite. I want the house, she said, voice thin. I laughed, shaking my head. No, you don't. You want to win. But you already lost. She was breathing faster now, the realization settling in. Warren, let's just... I turned, heading for the stairs. We're done talking, Tessa. Call your lawyer. I didn't look back as I left her sitting there, but I could feel it, the shift, the unraveling. She wasn't the one in control anymore. I was. Tessa tried to recover. That was expected. A woman like her wasn't going to roll over without scrambling for something to hold on to. She was smart, calculated. But the problem with people like that is they only know how to play when they're the ones setting the rules. I'd taken that from her. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She didn't even touch the envelope right away. Just sat there, staring at it, breathing through her nose like she was running the numbers in her head. I didn't give a damn what equation she was trying to solve. The outcome was already written. I spent that night at the shop. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There's something about the smell of leather, the weight of it in your hands, that keeps a man grounded. When I was a kid, my grandfather used to tell me that leatherworking wasn't just about shaping a product. It was about shaping yourself, learning patience, control. You rush, you ruin it, he used to say, guiding my hands when I was first learning to cut. I never forgot that. Mick showed up around 10, a six-pack in one hand, and a look on his face that told me he was expecting a mess. She take the papers? He asked, setting the beers down on the workbench. No idea, I said, punching holes into a thick hide. Left before she could start negotiating. He let out a low chuckle. Smart. You know she's gonna fight you on this. I'm counting on it. We cracked open the beers, drinking in silence for a bit. Mick knew when to talk and when to shut up, which is why he was the only person I wanted around right now. After a while, he shifted, leaning back against the counter. You got a plan for when she tries to make a scene? I nodded. Already handled. Mick raised a brow. Care to share? You'll see soon enough. The next morning, Tessa wasn't in the house when I went back to grab some fresh clothes. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter, the kind of thing a person writes when they're still pretending to be civil. We should talk before we rush into anything. I don't want things to get ugly. I smiled at that. Things were already ugly. She just hadn't accepted it yet. 2 days later, I got a call from Liz. She's playing the victim, she said, not bothering with small talk. Trying to spin this into a "we grew apart" narrative. I smirked. That the best she's got? For now. But she's stalling on signing. That was fine. Tessa could stall all she wanted. It wouldn't change a damn thing. I went back to work like nothing had happened. People in town started hearing whispers, small-town folks always do, but I didn't give them a show. I stayed steady, kept my head down, let Tessa wonder how the hell I wasn't unraveling. That's what threw her off the most. She expected anger, outbursts, maybe even some desperate plea to fix things. Instead, I acted like she didn't exist. A week later, I found out just how desperate she was getting. Mick and I were grabbing lunch at a diner down the road from the shop when he glanced toward the door and let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. I turned just as Vince Reynolds walked in, slick and confident like he owned the place. He spotted me immediately, made a beeline for our table. I didn't stand. Didn't tense. Just sat there, chewing my steak, waiting. Vince stopped at the edge of the table, smiling like we were old friends. Warren. I swallowed, wiped my mouth with my napkin. Vince. He gestured toward the empty seat across from me. Mind if I sit? I nodded toward the waitress. Only if you plan on ordering. I don't like people sitting at my table for free. Mick smirked, leaning back in his chair. Vince chuckled, trying to play it cool, and slid into the booth. Listen, I wanted to talk. Man to man. I cut another piece of steak, didn't answer. I know how this must feel, he continued. I get that it's a tough situation, but Tessa and I held up a hand. Stop right there. I set my knife down, locked eyes with him. You don't get a damn thing. He exhaled, nodding like he expected that reaction. Look, I'm not here to make things worse. I just want to make sure this doesn't turn into a drawn-out mess. I sipped my coffee. It won't. Good. He smiled, looking relieved, like he'd just won something. Then I leaned forward. Because I already won. His smile flickered. What? I let him sit with that for a second before I continued. See, Tessa thinks she was planning her way out. But the problem is, she left too many loose ends. Bank records. Emails. Hotel receipts. I got it all. And Liz? She's been salivating over this case since the second I walked into her office. Vince's expression didn't change, but I could see the shift in his eyes. The calculation. You can drag this out, I said, keeping my voice even. You can fight, throw money at lawyers, try to salvage your reputation. But at the end of the day, you'll be left with a woman who sold out a man who gave her 15 years. What makes you think she won't do the same to you? He blinked. Just once. Then his jaw tightened. Mick chuckled under his breath. Vince smoothed his tie, trying to reclaim his confidence. Warren, let's be reasonable. I stood up, dropping a 20 on the table for the bill. We're done here. I walked out without looking back. 2 days later, Tessa signed the papers. The ink on the papers dried faster than Tessa's excuses. Once she realized there was no winning, she gave up the act. No more careful phrasing, no more trying to have a conversation. Just cold silence and a quick signature. She wasn't interested in a fight she knew she'd lose. Liz called to confirm everything was filed. It's done. She waved spousal support. That made me smile. That must have stung. Oh, it did, Liz said. She tried to negotiate for the house, but when I reminded her of the financial records, she folded. Tessa wanted to walk away looking like the wounded party. She wanted to salvage whatever image she thought she had left. Too bad for her. Word had already spread. Small towns don't keep secrets, especially not juicy ones. Tessa was finding that out the hard way. I kept my head down, ran my shop, stayed steady. People noticed. At first, they didn't ask, just gave me nods of quiet respect when I walked into a room. Then, little by little, they started talking. Customers lingered longer, asked how I was doing, slipped in comments like, heard about Tessa, damn shame, or always figured you were too good for her. Mick heard more than I did. He was the type people confided in when they didn't think it would get back to me. He came by the shop one afternoon, arms crossed, smirking. She's in damage control mode. I didn't look up from the belt I was stitching. That right? She's telling people it was mutual, that you grew apart. I let out a dry chuckle. That's cute. She's also been trying to save face with her parents. Mick shook his head. They ain't buying it. Ran into her dad at the hardware store. He looked like he wanted to spit nails. Apparently, they cut her off. I didn't feel bad for her. She was a grown woman who made her choices. But it did confirm one thing. She was learning that betrayal came with a price. The first time I saw her after the divorce, it was at the grocery store. I was grabbing a pack of coffee when I spotted her a few aisles over, standing stiff back near the produce section, basket in one hand, phone in the other. She looked thinner, more put together than necessary for a mid-afternoon grocery run, like she was trying to prove something to herself. She caught my eye, hesitated, then started toward me like she had something to say. I turned, walked to the register, and left without a word. The past was dead, and I had no interest in digging it back up. The business was doing better than ever. Orders were rolling in, more than I could keep up with. I hired 2 more apprentices, a couple of kids in their 20s with good hands and steady minds. Seeing them work, watching them get better every day, reminded me why I did this in the first place. One afternoon, I was finishing up a custom saddle when Marianne Willow Foster walked into the shop. Willow had been around for as long as I could remember, floating in and out of town with her beads and scarves and talk of karma. She was Tessa's old friend, though they weren't close anymore. Too much history, too many differences. I wiped my hands on a rag. Afternoon, Willow. She gave me one of those knowing smiles, the kind that said she'd already decided why she was here. Warren. I nodded toward the counter. You looking for something, or just here to chat? She stepped forward, glancing around the shop, taking in the smell of tan leather and beeswax. Heard you've been doing well. Yep. She smiled again. And Tessa? Well, she hasn't. I shrugged. Not my problem. Willow sighed, tilting her head like she was deciding whether or not to push. You know, Warren, sometimes life has a way of balancing itself out. I met her gaze, steady. I don't believe in waiting for balance, Willow. Some things need a push. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded like she understood. I figured that's what you'd say. I didn't ask what Tessa had told her, and she didn't offer. She left a few minutes later, walking slow, like she wanted me to stop her. I didn't. That night, I sat in my workshop long after closing, running my hands over a fresh hide, thinking. About the shop, the apprentices, the orders stacking up. About how much lighter life felt now. I wasn't just moving on. I was winning. The day I signed the final paperwork for the house, I didn't feel a damn thing. No regret, no nostalgia. Just a clean break. I left Tessa to deal with whatever ghosts she had left in those walls. I'd built a life there, sure, but it wasn't home anymore. Instead, I moved into the cabin I'd been fixing up for years, a small place out by the hills with enough space to breathe. It had a workshop out back, just big enough for a solid workbench and my best tools. The air smelled like pine and fresh earth, not like old fights and quiet disappointments. Mick came by the first night I was there, a 6-pack in one hand, a brown paper bag in the other. He tossed the bag on the table. Housewarming gift, he said. I opened it. A brand new flask, leather-wrapped, with my initials pressed into the side. My own damn initials, stitched in my own shop, by one of my own apprentices. I smirked. You made the kid do it, huh? Mick took a beer, popped the cap. Damn right. Figured it was poetic or something. I turned the flask in my hands, feeling the work. Good stitching, clean lines. The kid had promise. You settling in? Mick asked. I nodded. Yeah, feels right. He sat back, stretching his legs. Saw Tessa the other day. She looked different. I didn't ask how. Didn't care. Instead, I walked to the porch, took in the view of the trees, the quiet stretch of land. She ever reach out? Mick asked from behind me. She tried. And I let out a slow breath. Tossed the letter. Didn't need to read it. Mick let out a low chuckle. Cold. Necessary. We sat there a while, drinking in silence, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The shop was busier than ever. Orders kept rolling in, and the apprentices were proving themselves. One day, I watched one of them, Ethan, 24, a quiet kid with a steady hand, stitch a bag with a focus I recognized. He didn't rush. He didn't second-guess. He just worked. I walked over, nodding toward his work. Good stitch. He looked up, grinned. Learn from the best. That hit me in a way I didn't expect. I clapped a hand on his shoulder, gave it a firm squeeze. Keep it up. Later that night, I sat in the workshop alone, running a hand over a fresh hide, feeling the weight of it. Strong. Durable. Built to last. just like me. The morning started like any other. Sun barely up, coffee hot, the shop already humming with the sounds of work. The smell of leather, oil, and sawdust mixed in the air, grounding me the way it always had. I stood at my workbench, running my hands over a belt strap, checking the grain, the cut, the give. It was solid. Good leather always is. Ethan was working the rivet press in the back, sleeves rolled up, jaws set. Across the shop, Caleb, the other apprentice, was cutting patterns, brow furrowed in concentration. They didn't need me hovering. They learned well. Mick walked in without knocking, like he always did, carrying 2 coffees. He set one on the workbench, nodded at the belt in my hands. Looks good. I took a sip. It is. He leaned against the counter, watching Ethan work. Kid's got the hands for it. He does. We stood in silence for a bit, just the sound of tools working, leather stretching, things being built right. Then Mick exhaled, shaking his head. Saw Tessa in town yesterday. I didn't say anything. She looked like hell. Still, I said nothing. She was with Vince. Or hell, maybe not with him. Looked like they were arguing. Loud, too. Not sure what about, but it wasn't pretty. I finished my coffee, set the empty cup down. Not my concern. Mick grinned, shaking his head. Damn right it ain't. I already knew how her story was ending. Vince wasn't the kind of man who stuck around when things got hard. He was a gambler, and the bet he placed on Tessa had already lost its shine. People like that don't build anything. They just use, take, and leave when the ground gets unsteady. She was alone now, and that was exactly what she deserved. The mail came in the afternoon, dropped on the counter by one of the apprentices. Bills, a couple of supplier notices, and one letter with handwriting I knew too well. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, then tossed it into the trash without opening it. Caleb, who'd seen the whole thing, raised a brow. Not gonna read it? Nope. He nodded like that made sense, went back to work. Later that night, I locked up the shop, took the long way home through town, the cool air settling in my lungs. I passed the old bar where Mick and I used to shoot pool, the diner where I'd spent more breakfast than I could count. These were my places, my town, my life. And I was still standing. I pulled up to the cabin, stepped out, and let the quiet settle around me. The house was mine. The land was mine. My work was mine. Everything Tessa had tried to take from me, everything Vince had tried to undermine, was still here, still thriving. And I hadn't just survived, I'd won. I walked into the workshop, the smell of fresh leather and sawdust greeting me like an old friend. My tools were lined up neatly on the bench, waiting for tomorrow's work. I picked up the flask Mick had given me, ran my thumb over the stitching. Ethan was right. The best lessons are passed down, taught by hands that know the weight of real work. I had learned from the men before me, and now I was doing the same for the next ones. That's what lasts. I twisted the cap off the flask, took a slow sip, and smiled. Some men beg to be valued. Others remind the world exactly who the hell they are.